I'm Michael Gillespie. I direct the Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment at FIU, and through the very great generosity of Joe Adler, we're able to have our first presentation in one of our series, Representations of Violence in the Humanities, that the Center is putting on. And I'm very excited about being here tonight at the Gable stage with an absolutely extraordinary group of panelists. Before I, before I introduce them, I do have a number of people to thank. I will say a year ago, the Center we began our season in 2011 with a presentation of the PBS documentary Parallel Lives, and then had a great discussion with Arva Parks and Dorothy Fields after the film. Before the film, I got up in front of everyone and began to thank this person and that person and this person. By the time we were driving home, my wife said to me, "It was great, but the next time, try to keep your thanks shorter than the actual presentation." They're briefer than they should be, but there are some very important people to thank. The first is Joe Adler and the staff of the Gable stage. This is an absolutely beautiful. And I can't think of a better place to begin such a very important topic, or a more generous individual to oversee it. And I'm very grateful to Joe and to everyone else here. For those of you who are regulars at the Gable stage, you're used to this environment. Those of you who are perhaps here for the first time and see what a gem this is, let me encourage you very strongly to come back and see the production of Ruined, which is currently running. It's very, very powerful, very moving, and like all of the Gable stage productions, it's extraordinarily well done. We are very fortunate to have this kind of a resource here in South Florida. We're also very fortunate to have WPBT Channel 2, our public television station, which records all of the events that the Center presents and puts them up on our website. So you will be able to relive the pleasure of this evening time and again just by going to the website. But I'm grateful to Neil Heckert, to Sarah Ryan, who is recording it tonight, and to everyone at Channel 2. As I am to Mitchell Kaplan and the staff at Books and Books, who very generously publicized this event, to Dean Kenneth Burton and the College of Arts and Sciences for their support, as well as Brian Shiner and the College of Arts, Architecture and the Arts, and particularly the Department of English and the Theater Department. I'm very grateful to the four panelists that we have here tonight, and I will introduce them briefly in just a moment, but I've been thinking all week just how fortunate I was to be able to get these people together, and I have to qualify that because it seems as if they did it through the magnetism of my own charm. It was because of Joe and their own generosity that brought this group together. But I'm very excited and deeply grateful that they're all here. I'm also very grateful to you for coming out tonight. The Center for the Humanities is not in competition with the Humanities Center at UM, which is a wonderful institution. But we have defined ourselves in a very different way from it and from most humanities centers. Our aim is to engage the community in conversations about the humanities. My wife and I have only been here 3 years, but we are struck by just how sophisticated South Florida is and how many people can speak with great insight on a range of topics related to the arts. And I feel very fortunate to be able to be part of conversations like this. What we wanted to do with the Center is to facilitate those kinds of conversations. A night like tonight, which has an audience made up of students, of regulars at the Gable stage, and of South Floridians in general, is a perfect example of what we strive for, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming and helping fulfill that, at least for an evening, fulfill that ambition. Tonight we are very fortunate to have on the panel, and I'm simply going to give their titles. I've talked long enough, and although I am intoxicated by the sound of my own voice, I expect several of you don't share that feeling, so I will truncate what I'm saying now by simply introducing the panelists with their titles. Joseph Adler, who is the producing artistic director of the Gable Stage. Dr. David Castellanos, who is professor and founding chair of the Department of Psychology at the Psychiatry of the College of Medicine at FIU. Philip Church, who is the associate director of external engagement in the theater department at FIU, and Christine Dolan, who is the drama critic for the Miami Herald. We also had hoped to have Neil Heckert, who is the vice president of programming from Channel 2 here tonight. There was a death in the family, and he was unable to come. But as I said at the beginning, Channel 2 has been supporting us from the start, so I know he's here in spirit. The presentations will be relatively short, about 5 minutes. Each panelist has a different homework assignment that I've given them, and just so they would speak on, so there'd be less overlap than might otherwise occur. Each will talk for about 5 minutes, and then we will begin discussing and get your reaction as well. Thank you again for coming, and let me ask Joe to start us off.
Well, so glad you're all here. I think it's interesting that there is such a good crowd, although one would think sometimes that when you hear a subject about violence in the theater that we have people flowing out into the aisles, because there is this misperception, I think, that violence in the theater sells, and that people really can't wait to buy a ticket when they hear there's some violence on stage. I can tell you from my own experience, having done more than my share of violence on stage, I suppose, that isn't necessarily the truth, the case at all. As a matter of fact, when I did a play called Blasted, and tried to prepare the audience by telling them that there were going to be things going on stage that they might find disturbing, I was accused by a critic, not one of the critics who's here tonight, of trying to use that to entice the audience. That the mere mention that you might see some things that you find disturbing would sell the play. Well, take it from me, that didn't happen. I'm many things, and I'm not proud of all of them, but I don't think I'm stupid. And my experience has taught me that violence in the theater is not like violence in film. You can sell a film, especially to a younger audience today, by hyping the violence. It works. It doesn't work in the theater. One of the major reasons for that, I think, is obvious. When you stand in line waiting to see films that were hyped with violence in the movies, you see hardly ever any white hair in the audience. You go to see a play, you don't see too many young people. So it seems that the older audience loves to go to see violent movies, but the younger audience. But the older audience that goes to the theater, no, that's not really their cup of tea. And it's interesting to me because when you talk about violence in the theater, you have to go back to Jacobean and Elizabethan theater. But then after that, the theater of cruelty, or the Grand Guignol. Grand Guignol was, I think, turn of the century, early 1900s up through between the First and Second World War. Ended before the Second World War because they say the World War was so hideous and so disturbing that the audience wasn't there for it. But in Grand Guignol, they used to get a big kick out of doing realistic people having their heads cut off by guillotines and all kinds of strange murders and things. And Anthony Artaud, created Theater of Cruelty, which kind of climaxed in the 50s or 60s, and some people think Barat Saad was a good example of that. And actually, I think you can carry that forward to the Irish plays of Martin McDonagh. I think that you can definitely see that thread going through plays like the plays we did here, especially Lieutenant of Inishmore. Violence on stage is totally different than violence on film. I just saw the movie of Killer Joe, directed by John Frankenheimer. It didn't work for me at all, and he didn't deviate very much from the script. So it isn't because he changed the script. It isn't the script at all. What worked on stage didn't work on screen at all. Felt the same way about Bug, and Frankenheimer made that movie from Tracy Letts' play as well. Now, why do they work on stage and not on film? And some people don't think they worked on stage either, I'm sure. I think they did. But the point is, when you do violence on stage, when we did Lieutenant of Inishmore, for example, we had one scene that I loved because we had a blackout that went on for, 40 seconds. We tried to make it as quickly as possible, during which time several people scurried around in the dark, spreading red tempera paint all over the stage and dragging out bodies that were, mannequins that looked like they'd been beheaded and their arms had been chopped off, whatever, okay? Lights come up, the whole stage is bathed in blood, and their people have been chopped, standing, and they're continuing to chop them up. The audience gasps at first, and then realizes that this is actually very funny. It's black humor. Now, I got to tell you, I love hitting people and disturbing their delicate sensibilities. I have to confess, I'll cop to it. I do it. I like it. But the point is, the idea of somebody running out of the theater saying, "Oh my God, this is so hideous," it's paint. It's obviously paint. It's not the same as the stuff they do in films. Moreover, it has a different impact on you than a movie. I go to see these silly movies young people go to today. I even went to see this ridiculous new Batman movie. The carnage in that movie is just unbelievable. You couldn't possibly keep track of how many people died violently in that movie. But I say violently. It's not violent at all. You don't see much blood. There's no very little suffering. What people seem to object to is real violence, which is people being really, really affected. I don't mean the audience, but people to whom violence is being perpetrated, being affected by it. Now that, to me, is the only kind of violence that you should have. Violence that short of that is to me, abhorrent. But we live in a world where you can't. I remember during the Korean War and during Vietnam, there were color pictures of people being carried off the field of battle. Our sons, well, they weren't daughters then, but our sons, our husbands, or whatever. And you see them wounded and screaming and medic and whatever. Today we sanitize them. You're not allowed to see that anymore. And when they run a picture that happens to be taken by somebody's camera of a horrible incident happening in reality, they preface it with the comment, if you have children, don't let them watch, and if you have delicate sensibilities, don't watch it. And invariably, when you watch it, it doesn't have any impact whatsoever. It's usually a long shot. You hear a bullet, somebody falls. There's no impact whatsoever, but it's real, so therefore it's shocking. Shocking. I have a lot of theories about why people object to violence and what really constitutes violence, but that's it for me for a start. We can come back to that, I'm sure, later. Who's next?
Thanks very much. Dan, would you take it?
Oh, sure, and I think it would make my mother very happy. My name is Dan Castellanos, and yes, I am from the Department of Psychiatry at your FIU, at your College of Medicine. And I was joking with Michael, I don't know why I'm here. I'm the one that quite doesn't fit with the group. But I'm going to give a crack at addressing how is stage violence depicted on stage different from real violence? Because that's what I do. I run psychiatric emergency departments, and that's one of the things that we deal with every day. And several factors came up. One being how violence depicted on stage tends to be instrumental for whatever purposes the playwright or the director or the plot that is being played out on stage. And in real life, violence isn't always experienced that way. That it's not viewed as necessarily as a vehicle to obtain an end. Now we know when you break it down, there could be some interpretations of violence in real life, and we know that violence is a very broad term, and we can maybe address that in the discussion, but that in real life, violence doesn't always follow as much of a linear path as it may in real life. In stage violence, it doesn't follow. In real life, that is, it's not as linear. We also know that in violence, depictions of violence on stage, it could also be more likely to provoke certain stereotypes or archetypes in the viewers. And again, in real life, especially impulsive violence and non-premeditated violence, is maybe the reactions are much more varied. But when I sat down and really thought about this, it really comes down to, in my mind, when you really look at it, it's when you look at, you can break down violence, and you can break it down as what we call a moderating variable, and then you look at the individual, and it's the individual characteristics of the person who is exposed to that violence, whether it's on stage or in the real world, if you will, that it's the individual characteristics that are the mediating factors. So the moderating variables of the violence that's depicted, whether it's real, you're experiencing it in real life or on stage, include define or they provoke how the severity of the reactions and certain types of reactions, but it's really the individual and all their idiosyncrasies and all the history that one brings that ultimately helps define what mediates the reactions to the violence. And by way of disclaimer, tonight's discussion is not a discussion about violence in campus and in Aurora, Colorado, and things like that. This is not, that goes beyond the scope of this forum, but that ultimately it's the individual and how they have their history of experience with violence, their perceptions. Gorsinski talked about the map is not the territory. That is, the reality is what you really perceive it. And so therefore it's your interpretation of it. It's affected by your historical perspectives, your personality, your emotional reactions, and ultimately these cognitive processes of perception, interpretation, and processing. So, hopefully that will be provocative enough that we can have a good discussion afterwards as well.
Michael asked me to focus on the director directing violence on stage. And I'm probably the wrong director to be exploring that, because whether it has been through the process of raising two children who are now in their early 20s, but the moral line still holds, and one is still doing that parenting stuff, and guns and so forth when they were very young was an issue in my home in terms of me accepting a certain amount of... as a director, I don't go out of my way to find plays that contain violence in order to provoke the audience into some cathartic questioning of themselves or society or whatever. However, I do not continually do remounts of Mary Poppins or, Little Mary Sunshine. So I do find plays that provoke, because I think, Joe's mentioned it, provocation is huge. It's really essential and central to what the theater offers an audience. We, in a way, have to provoke you. You paid your money. You know what you're going to. You may never have seen the play before, but the very act of attending theater, you are already part of the converted. I need to, I know, I told Michael I'm going to go off into another box, because there's actually a central question that concerns me far, far more. And we've already addressed the fact that it won't be covered this evening, but I still think it's a huge issue. Not that I'm going to open up. So let me go to the directing and directing violence on stage. I think, there are plays like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, okay, and there's a certain degree of not just verbal, but also physical violence in that play. So from a practical point of view, a director really has to remain in the controlling seat in terms of how far, or sensing where those actors are going toward reality. It's a flesh and blood art. You are flesh and blood in the audience, we are flesh and blood on stage, and therefore that incredible connection, which makes theatre so different from film, exists. So when actors love to push the envelope. I mean, they really do, and we expect them to. It's called risk-taking. It's called taking themselves emotionally closer and closer to the threshold of something that they themselves sense. But a director has to be, I think, very tuned in to each and every actor, depending on the demands of the character they're playing. But there are some plays, as Joe mentioned, Martin McDonough, where the characters are almost beyond rational. And how far is the actor moving into that black hole of themselves? Actors are expected to go there. That's why they're actors. So the director's got to be very, very vigilant in making sure that the audience doesn't sense, and I think audiences are very discerning in sensing when the actor is perhaps out of control. So is it the character out of control, or is it the actor within the character who has tipped the balance? I'm going to say that when I was a student at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, I actually tipped the balance in my final performance. It was Icarus's Mother by Joe, Fool for Love, Sam Shepard. Yeah, Sam Shepard. And the character I was playing ends up with a 3-page monologue. And he starts to run around the stage, and these maroons are being let off in these huge oil cans around the stage. And it's a very surreal ending to this play. And emotionally, as an actor, young actor, I went over that threshold. That's the only time it ever happened. But, you know, it's a time when the actor says, whoa, wait a minute, I tipped the balance. Now, you're in a play with violence, and you have the safety of the other actor. You've got to, you have, some plays really can take the actor to that place of reality and truth, where they are, they stand at that kind of threshold. So the director, I think, has got to be extremely careful of that. The question I have in my mind, and I better pass it on now because, you know, this could really open up a can of worms, is why we are so magnetized and so drawn to violence. What is this compelling? I mean, you may buy a ticket for a play at Gable Stage and actually not know the play, and that's fine. Then suddenly, you know, during the course of the evening, there's all this stuff going on. But for the most part, what is it in our human nature that draws us? And it isn't that theatre necessarily makes a financial killing on plays, excuse the pun, but on plays with violence. Joe's totally right about the film world, which is very troubling, because the film world, Hollywood absolutely does make an economic killing with films and video games that are filled with violence. And I think there is a moral question, which I know is not for tonight, Michael, but there is a moral question as to how effective is theatre and film on the young psyche that is consistently in front of it. We can't go there because tonight is about violence in theatre. But it's a question that troubles me, and I open these discussions up with my students, and there are 1 or 2 students here in the audience. I mean, quite often these issues come up, and I think they're important issues for theatre and film to be raised. But I think I better kind of leave it there right now.
My subject is, do you review and react to plays differently if they happen to be violent? And Joe stole a little bit of my thunder because in getting ready to come over here this evening, I looked back over some of the reviews I'd done of shows that Joe has done here. And he is masterful in many, many ways. And one of those ways is in the ways he stages violence, and they're quite different. Violence in theater has been around since the Greeks. I mean, violence is a facet of our human nature. and theater at its best reflects human nature. I think that it's another tool for playwrights, for directors, for actors to tell a story. And as lamentable as it may be, it's a fact of life. Despite rumors to the contrary, critics are human too. Some of them loathe violence. I was talking to a colleague of mine and telling her I was coming to do this panel, and he said, "Oh, I hate any kind of violence in the theater." Well, fine, don't go to the theater. Or don't go to the theater if you know it's going to be a play that contains violence. So if a critic feels that way, you could argue he or she probably shouldn't be a critic, but definitely he shouldn't review anything like Medea or the Scottish play or anything by Martin McDonagh. Generally, violence in the theater isn't like a Quentin Tarantino movie. It isn't that exaggerated, although the violence that Joe and his amazing team was able to create for Lieutenant of Inishmore was extraordinary. But it was sort of cartoonishly tinged violence. So that in and of itself created a distancing effect. Yes, you saw people chopping up body parts, but you knew they were rubber body parts, and you knew that was paint on the stage, and you got to the deeper point that McDonagh was trying to make, thanks to Joe and the actors and the crew. When you're looking at a play, you should try, as a critic, you should try to assess whether this violence is a believable plot development, whether it makes a point about a character or a situation. Is it gratuitous? Is it being used there simply to try to shock us, to try to get a reaction? And depending on your answers to those questions, you should address those in a review. I've seen violence depicted in so many different ways in plays. I did not see this, but I saw an exhibition showing it. Julie Taymor directed a production of the opera Oedipus Rex in Japan. And her Oedipus blinded himself, and Jocasta, who was played by Jessie Norman, hung herself. And to depict his tears and the blood from the blinding, she just had red ribbons coming down from the actor's face. Now that's very stylized, but oh my God, it was incredible, and it was extremely effective. On the other hand, Joe did Blasted by Sarah Kane, which is an extraordinary play. This woman didn't write very many plays, and she committed suicide. But she had a lot to say on so many levels. What Joe and the company were able to do in Blasted was extraordinary too, because you would get a blackout, the lights would come back up seconds later, and this hotel room that was very nice and tidy at the start of the play was completely destroyed as if by a bomb. That play had torture, it had rape, it had combat, it had, everything that would frighten a violence-averse person in the audience. But it was all in the service of telling an incredible story. And, P.S., the actor and actress who starred in that play are in love and probably will get married. And they met doing that show. So, make-believe is a wonderful thing. And finally, I wanted to add that if you haven't seen Ruined, which is currently on here, it just opened last weekend. It's by Lynn Nottage, set in Congo, telling the story of 4 women whose lives have been touched by atrocity and violence and rapes and murder that surround them in the Congo. You might think that this play would be very violent. It is not physically very violent. You see soldiers coming in with guns, and nothing will make me want to turn and run for an exit faster than seeing an actor walk on the stage with a gun, because I hate sudden gunshots. But they never fire the guns. But the most extraordinary, compelling moment in the play happens right up there when an actress tells the story of her character, of how her character was working in a garden one day, and soldiers came and took her captive, raped her, killed her baby, and took her into the jungle and kept her enslaved for months, only to release her, have her go back home, and be rejected by her husband and family. No violence whatsoever takes place during that scene. This woman is talking to another woman. But because of the way that theater engages those who listen and those who watch, your imagination takes you there. You can see this happening to this poor woman. And that is the power of theater and violence that doesn't even need to be shown.
Michael asked me to focus on the director directing violence on stage. And I'm probably the wrong director to be exploring that, because whether it has been through the process of raising two children who are now in their early 20s, but the moral line still holds, and one is still doing that parenting stuff, and guns and so forth when they were very young was an issue in my home in terms of me accepting a certain amount of... as a director, I don't go out of my way to find plays that contain violence in order to provoke the audience into some cathartic questioning of themselves or society or whatever. However, I do not continually do remounts of Mary Poppins or, you know, Little Mary Sunshine, something. So I do find plays that provoke, because I think, you know, Joe's mentioned it, provocation is huge. It's really essential and central to what the theater offers an audience. We, in a way, have to provoke you. You paid your money, you know what you're going to. You may never have seen the play before, but the very act of attending theater, you are already part of the converted. I need to, yeah, I know, I told Michael I'm going to go off into another box, because there's actually a central question that concerns me far, far more. And we've already addressed the fact that it won't be covered this evening, but I still think it's a huge issue. Not that I'm going to open up. So let me go to the directing and directing violence on stage. I think, I mean, there are plays like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, okay, and there's a certain degree of not just verbal, but also physical violence in that play. So from a practical point of view, a director really has to remain in the controlling seat in terms of how far, or sensing where those actors are going toward reality. It's a flesh and blood art. You are flesh and blood in the audience, we are flesh and blood on stage, and therefore that incredible connection, which makes theatre so different from film, exists. So when actors love to push the envelope. I mean, they really do, and we expect them to. It's called risk-taking. It's called taking themselves emotionally closer and closer to the threshold of something that they themselves sense. But a director has to be, I think, very tuned in to each and every actor, depending on the demands of the character they're playing. But there are some plays, as Joe mentioned, Martin McDonough, where the characters are almost beyond rational. And how far is the actor moving into that black hole of themselves? Actors are expected to go there. That's why they're actors. So the director's got to be very, very vigilant in making sure that the audience doesn't sense, and I think audiences are very discerning in sensing when the actor is perhaps out of control. So is it the character out of control, or is it the actor within the character who has tipped the balance? I'm going to say that when I was a student at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, I actually tipped the balance in my final performance. It was Icarus's Mother by Joe, Fool for Love, Sam Shepard. Yeah, Sam Shepard. And the character I was playing ends up with a 3-page monologue. And he starts to run around the stage, and these maroons are being let off in these huge oil cans around the stage. And it's a very surreal ending to this play. And emotionally, as an actor, young actor, I went over that threshold. That's the only time it ever happened. But, you know, it's the time when the actor says, whoa, wait a minute, I tipped the balance. Now, you're in a play with violence, and you have the safety of the other actor. You've got to, you have, some plays really can take the actor to that place of reality and truth. where they are, they stand at that kind of threshold. So the director, I think, has got to be extremely careful of that. The question I have in my mind, and I better pass it on now because this could really open up a can of worms, is why we are so magnetized and so drawn to violence. What is this compelling? I mean, you may buy a ticket for a play at Gable Stage and actually not know the play, and that's fine. Then suddenly, during the course of the evening, there's all this stuff going on. But for the most part, what is it in our human nature that draws us? And it isn't that theatre necessarily makes a financial killing on plays, excuse the pun, but on plays with violence. Joe's totally right about the film world, which is very troubling, because the film world, Hollywood absolutely does make an economic killing with films and video games that are filled with violence. And I think there is a moral question, which I know is not for tonight, Michael, but there is a moral question as to how effective is theatre and film on the young psyche that is consistently in front of it. We can't go there because tonight is about violence in theatre. But it's a question that troubles me, and I open these discussions up with my students, and there are one or two students here in the audience. I mean, quite often these issues come up, and I think they're important issues for theatre and film to be raised. But I think I better kind of leave it there right now.
My subject is, do you review and react to plays differently if they happen to be violent? And Joe stole a little bit of my thunder because in getting ready to come over here this evening, I looked back over some of the reviews I'd done of shows that Joe has done here. And he is masterful in many, many ways. And one of those ways is in the ways he stages violence, and they're quite different. Violence in theater has been around since the Greeks. I mean, violence is a facet of our human nature, and theater at its best reflects human nature. I think that it's another tool for playwrights, for directors, for actors to tell a story, and as lamentable as it may be, it's a fact of life. Despite rumors to the contrary, critics are human too. Some of them loathe violence. I was talking to a colleague of mine and telling her I was coming to do this panel, and she said, "Oh, I hate any kind of violence in the theater." Well, fine, don't go to the theater. Or don't go to the theater if you know it's going to be a play that contains violence. So if a critic feels that way, you could argue he or she probably shouldn't be a critic, but definitely he shouldn't review anything like Medea or the Scottish play or anything by Martin McDonagh. Generally, violence in the theater isn't like a Quentin Tarantino movie. It isn't that exaggerated, although the violence that Joe and his amazing team was able to create for Lieutenant of Inishmore was extraordinary. But it was sort of cartoonishly tinged violence. So that in and of itself created a distancing effect. Yes, you saw people chopping up body parts, but you knew they were rubber body parts, and you knew that was paint on the stage, and you got to the deeper point that McDonagh was trying to make, thanks to Joe and the actors and the crew. When you're looking at a play, you should try, as a critic, you should try to assess whether this violence is a believable plot development, whether it makes a point about a character or a situation. Is it gratuitous? Is it being used there simply to try to shock us, to try to get a reaction? And depending on your answers to those questions, you should address those in a review. I've seen violence depicted in so many different ways in plays. I did not see this, but I saw an exhibition showing it. Julie Taymor directed a production of the opera Oedipus Rex in Japan. And her Oedipus blinded himself, and Jocasta, who was played by Jessie Norman, hung herself. And to depict his tears and the blood from the blinding, she just had red ribbons coming down from the actor's face. Now that's very stylized, but oh my God, it was incredible, and it was extremely effective. On the other hand, Joe did Blasted by Sarah Kane, which is an extraordinary play. This woman didn't write very many plays, and she committed suicide. But she had a lot to say on so many levels. What Joe and the company were able to do in Blasted was extraordinary too, because you would get a blackout, the lights would come back up seconds later, and this hotel room that was very nice and tidy at the start of the play was completely destroyed as if by a bomb. That play had torture, it had rape, it had combat, it had, everything that would frighten a violence-averse person in the audience. But it was all in the service of telling an incredible story. And P.S., the actor and actress who starred in that play are in love and probably will get married. And they met doing that show. So make-believe is a wonderful thing. And finally, I wanted to say, I wanted to add that if you haven't seen Ruined, which is currently on here, it just opened last weekend. It's by Lynn Nottage, set in Congo, telling the story of 4 women whose lives have been touched by atrocity and violence and rapes and murder that surround them in the Congo. You might think that this play would be very violent. It is not physically very violent. You see soldiers coming in with guns, and nothing will make me want to turn and run for an exit faster than seeing an actor walk on the stage with a gun, because I hate sudden gunshots. But they never fire the guns. But the most extraordinary, compelling moment in the play happens right up there when an actress tells the story of her character, of how her character was working in a garden one day, and soldiers came and took her captive, raped her, killed her baby, and took her into the jungle and kept her enslaved for months, only to release her, have her go back home, and be rejected by her husband and family. No violence whatsoever takes place during that scene. This woman is talking to another woman. But because of the way that theater engages those who listen and those who watch, your imagination takes you there. You can see this happening to this poor woman. And that is the power of theater and violence that doesn't even need to be shown.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I took students to the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford for 2 weeks as part of a study abroad program this past summer. One of the plays was Richard III. And we spoke to some of the audience. There were actually a number of young people in the audience, the evening show, and also our own students. And they were so disappointed there was no gore. They were so disappointed there was no battle, where they were actually seeing. Now, these are students, of course, that are visiting the cinemas more than they're visiting the theaters of ritual. And every time we see violence on stage in theater, it really is a form, in a way, of ritual. And, like we just heard, it goes back to the Greeks. And we accept violence as ritual. Even modern-day violence becomes ritualized in some form with the storytelling of theater. But I thought that was an interesting response from young people watching Richard III. And it was an excellent production. And of course, I went away going, oh, wow, how neat. They didn't do all that fighting and all that, hacking of this, that, and the other. And that was the response. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Absence of violence.
Well, thank you all for a wonderful introduction to the first half of the evening, a wonderful presentation of a series of perspectives from which we can all develop and react and expand. While you're gathering your thoughts for your questions, let me intrude several commercial announcements. If you are here from one of the classes at FIU and would like your presence to be recorded, there is a sign-in sheet that will be up here at the end of the evening. There is going to be a more formal approach, formal in the sense, more traditionally academic approach to the same topic that we're engaging tonight in another month. 4 weeks from tonight, on October 10th, Stephen DiBenedetto, who is here from the theater department at the University of Miami, will talk about violence in the theater at a formal lecture at FIU in the Green Library at 7 p.m. There are flyers on the near the door on the way out if you're interested. And if you like if you're interested in any of the programs that the center is putting on, we have another flyer that lists our early fall programs. Please don't hesitate to take one of those as well. Let me ask now if you have questions, comments that you would like to make.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something. You were talking about the Richard III and the lack of violence. And how many of you saw the Patrick Stewart, the Scottish play, Patrick Stewart did? That was ran in New York, but I think it traveled around the world. I thought it was a brilliant production. And it had at least as much blood and gore as any Martin McDonagh production has. And it's interesting because I think it was totally warranted. The Scottish play, certainly it doesn't feel tacked on. It doesn't feel like it's there to try to sell tickets in any way, but it certainly helps convey the impact that's there. And what's interesting is some of the same people that will sit and look at a McDonagh play, or not look at a McDonagh play because they object to violence, will totally buy into it if it's the Scottish play. Because it's Shakespeare, so it's okay. Or if it's Oedipus, or if it's, a Greek tragedy, or if it's Titus Andronicus, which has been done in incredible violent productions, because these are classics, and therefore it's okay. We'll sit through the great, It's the perception that audiences bring to it that, to me is so interesting in theater. Nobody's ever claimed, I saw Virginia Woolf 3 or 4 times, and that's why I beat my wife. I mean, people come out, you're always reading, I saw that movie. Scorsese made a movie, Taxi Driver. Somebody claimed they tried to kill, what's her name, Jodie Foster or something. People are always, Hinckley, people come out. Sometimes I wish theater had that impact on somebody. Sad to say. But you realize that we appeal to such a small segment of the population. Such a tiny sliver of the population goes to the theater, especially the kind of theater we're talking about. So we don't have that same kind. Now maybe that's good, but what does have that impact? Listen, how can you call violence in theater violence when young people are sitting there playing the kind of games they're playing on video games they're playing? I mean, they see that's obscenity to me. Violence that is perpetrated without any real reason, and without any sign of the suffering that goes on, both on the part of the receiver and the perpetrator, is obscene. And that's what I see in movies. Now, you don't often see that on stage. Occasionally, I guess you could argue you do, but in film and in video games, it's all mindless violence done to people who have no meaning. They're not even characters with identifiable names, let alone identifiable characteristics. Sometimes you can't even tell which uniform they're wearing. You look at movies today. John Ford said it's essential in a good Western. The audience has to know who are the cowboys and who are the Indians. I see these movies today. I can't tell who's on which side. I just see people doing terrible things to one another. Maybe you younger people can tell. You're used to video games, so you can keep up with and tell who's doing it. I don't think so, by the way. I'm sure you can, because it's edited in such a way that you can't. Occasionally you see a head come off or an arm flying or some body part. You don't know who's doing what to whom. So, I mean, that to me is obscenity. Now, violence in a movie, let's say, like Paths of Glory, Stanley Kubrick, I think one of his greatest movies, that's a truly anti-war movie. It doesn't glorify war, and in the end, it shows you know, the horrors of war, and it even manages at the end to make you realize that the men who are perpetrating these horrors on one another, deep at the core, in that wonderful scene when the soldiers start jeering at that poor little, girl, the German girl, who is, by the way, Kubrick's wife, when she's singing, they can't help themselves. They join in singing with her. That's, as Christine says, what transcends the violence in the Congo in this play is the fact that there is some hope that the kind of men who want nothing to do with their wife because she's been raped can somehow change and learn from that experience, albeit too late. You know, I mean, obscenity is violence without any real impact. It's the kind of thing that I see on television and the movies. I rarely see that kind of violence in theater. I don't think people want to pay that kind of money or give up 2 hours of their time to sit and watch mindless violence. And frankly, as I said, it doesn't sell, doesn't work. As a matter of fact, as Christine said, even in this play, I knew when we picked this play to do with this huge cast, that the fact that it deals with war, the fact that it deals with the horrors of the Congo, the fact that people hear about rape, is going to make it a tough sell. And fortunately, Christine stresses in her review the fact that it does have redeeming value and that it is uplifting. But I don't know how many people are still willing to go for that, you know, because they see the other aspect. They say, I can watch that on the news, because it is. It was on the front page, stories about the Congo on the front page of the New York Times twice last week.
Can we hear your comments or questions?
Yes, there's somebody here.
Okay. I mean, my head is flooded. So I will spill over. The phrase that kept coming to my mind was a willing suspension of disbelief. When I come to the theater, there is an intimacy with a person. When you were telling the story about what she was saying up there about her being kidnapped and raped, I was involved with it. They weren't just words.
You should hear her sing.
Yeah.
Well, I can only imagine, and I will hear her words. When there's a play that was made hundreds of years ago, and it's from Scotland, I have an ability to hear the words, but also they're different from me. They're speaking different dialect. So I'm more protected as a participant. When it's paths of glory, I'm not protected. And there's a difference for me if I'm seeing a Batman movie, because I can have a willing suspension of disbelief. I'll go along with the cartoon, but I know it's a cartoon. I am not humanly involved in the way I am in the theater. Or with a Paths of Glory film. So, and that goes with whether it's violence or sexuality or pain or anger or anything. The issue of the writer and the director is, you know, when it works brilliantly, it's because that connection is made with the actor, with the words. And again, I go back to willing suspension of disbelief, because I didn't see the play with the bodies. And I can see that it could be funny, but I can also connect with the imagery of it. If I'm willing to, I can stay stuck and say, oh, you know, this is nothing but a bunch of mannequins, and protect myself. Or I might be willing to acknowledge the symbolism of these been the case. And I might be affected very differently. So,
Would any of you care to react to that?
There's somebody up there.
I'm having trouble visualizing how violence would be portrayed on stage without there actually being gore and blood. And things
Without
like
what?
that. Sorry?
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I'm having trouble visualizing how violence can be portrayed on stage without there being gore and blood. Do you have any examples of violence being portrayed like maybe without all that?
Without? You mean?
Well, could I just jump in there and tell you that there are really fine writers. Harold Pinter comes to mind in terms of you're very aware in the audience that it goes beyond menace, which is what he was a merchant of menace, right? It goes into violence, and you're very aware in the audience. It's a psychological violence, right? It's the interplay of these characters. But the audience, if it's staged really well, with actors who are really intuitively in tune with those characters, the power of violence from a really fine Pinter, and really, I think just about any of Pinter's plays come under that umbrella. There might be an example of a play that is filled with violence, and yet not one drop of blood is shed. You know, yeah. I don't know if that addresses how do you put a play on stage. Yeah, right.
Well, and also, truthfully, not shilling for Ruined, but there's one moment when a soldier goes for a girl, but he doesn't hurt her. All the violence in Ruined is talked about. It's not shown, but trust me, it's horrifying. And to go back to your point, a play like that sometimes is very hard to watch. But if I'm sitting in that theater seat and I find myself sitting up straighter or sitting back in my seat or at the very end of the play because of the final moment and image almost crying, that's worth 1,000 times what anybody pays for a ticket. That's what people who love theater go to the theater for. That's the power of theater.
Yeah.
To answer the question, because it's a good question, 85% of the time when you see violence in theater, you do not actually see violence. It's usually staged in a way that either it happens in the blackout or I saw King Lear at Stratford years and years ago where they blind somebody. And the way the bodies are facing the audience, you think you're seeing it, but you do not actually see it. And in fact, when somebody actually hacks off a limb on stage or something like that, it feels terribly fake. And it takes you out of it, and you don't believe it. And the only way you can get away with it is as Julie Taymor did, where you have some kind of stylistic, artistic thing. The more realistic they do it on stage, the less you believe it. It has a lot to do with really smart people like Joe. You think you see it, but you don't. Because otherwise, trust me, there's nothing stupider than seeing blood actually spurting. It doesn't work.
It is very challenging as a college director, professor, teacher, directing and working with young people who relate to realism. And Michael, you probably will Michael Yanni's here. He is our teacher of directing and dramaturgy at FIU. We have to bring those students into the language of theater, which is very much a language based on metaphor and on symbol and on ritual, and of course on that history. But students coming in whose experience with performance is really the screen, and the screen beckoning in a very real way. And every time you go back to a film, there's more, unless you go and see a fantasy film, Harry Potter or something. The realism of a film set in today's world audiences demand, I want to identify closer and closer and closer to these people that live in my world, the 21st century world, who are using all the technology that I use at home, who have the sensibilities and feelings. So those young people are coming in from high schools, or transferring in, and they're bringing that with them. And it's a very interesting challenge. So when they face this thing of representing violence or meet a scene that maybe has violence in it, they're referencing where they're coming from. And their experience is incredibly shallow, of course, at those tender years of 19, 20, 21 years old. So that is an interesting challenge. Joe works a great deal with actors who are primed into theater. It is their profession, and they've moved through. And Joe himself has stabled, some really fine actors here and seen them grow and develop, which has really been fantastic. But there is a challenge with today's young actors, and let me tell you something, in Stratford in England, the young actor, oh boy, can you ever see chalk and cheese? Can you see apples and oranges on stage? The young actors coming in from the drama schools, who are the freshmen, joining the experienced actors, and of course every generation it's been like that, but today there seems to be an even more marked division, not just in technique, acting technique, but there's a whole psyche that's moving in.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, I'm sorry, because I kind of wish there's going to be a forum about film, because I am so restrained here. I want to talk actually about film.
Well, say what you want.
Well, okay. Look,
It won't make a damn bit of difference what I say anyway. So go ahead.
no, well, the thing is, the murders that are going on, okay, the Columbine, the Colorado, the Holmes, the whole Joker, Batman, we are seeing a pandemic. And my question is this. Yes, theater and film tell stories, and we're drawn to see stories and listen to stories, and some of them we've heard before, but they're in different time periods or costumes or contexts or whatever. But then, why is violence increasing? Why? I mean, you're not going to tell me that violence is falling away in society. I mean, if you open up the Herald, every other page, if not every page, you'll see some kind of homicide or crime passionnel where, and we know the gun issue is a problem. But then you've got role models. And those role models are not so much in theater because we wish that number of audience are not coming to the theater. They're going to the cinema. And the role models are there. Hollywood is sidestepping. They're not stepping up to the plate and being accountable for the films that they are creating. And I personally believe that it is about imitation, that young people do watch role models, especially when those models are playing criminals. Or, through a catharsis of the theater cinema act, people are going away saying, hey, the solution to my problem is easy. I just blow the person away. And I've just got a thing about this, I really do. I get very passionate about thinking about it, because the increase is incredible.
Well, let me, before we go, and I would like to hear from the audience, Dan, you've already talked about violence, and you probably have a much more sophisticated sense of it, actual violence, than any of us. Would you like to comment on?
Well, yeah, I do think it's a little bit more complicated than a simple, more of a modeling or imitation kind of perspective. And my perspective is that we talk about exposure to violence. And the violence can be fictional or non-fictional, and it could be real life violence and not. And there's a whole set of characteristics or variables that mediate that. And so, for example, one is how much one identifies with a victim of violence. That you're going to be affected more if you identify with either the perpetrator or the victim of the violence, of the violent behavior. And you're going to be probably more affected with the more direct the exposure of the violence is versus not. So if someone is killed right in front of me, I am going to be much more effective. We're talking about non-combat violence now, right? I'm going to be much more effective than if I read about so-and-so in Washington State that perpetrated certain crimes. But from an individual point of view, it's the exposure, the violent act is one variable, but we think, the violent behavior gets expressed in people that have this diathesis, this predisposition to it. So if you take the general population and you expose them to violence, they'll feel certain things, they may react, but they're not necessarily going to display a violent behavior as in response to seeing a film, a play, etc. But if you have these long-standing predispositions, as we call the diathesis, and then from there we get into a lot of speculation what that is, then things like violence or aggression, in my way, which is what the term is more likely to have an impact and more likely to lead to the expression of that as a behavior in the future.
I think there was a question over on the far side of the room.
Yeah. Well, as far as today's community goes, our generation, the younger generation, we're so used to hearing about violence every single day that it's become second nature to us. Whether we're reading it in the newspaper, or whether we're texting about it, or going on Google, it's something that we just kind of pass off. How often, or how many of you in this room have had a gun held up to your head? You know, honestly. So my question is, how do we bring this kind of neutral generation into the theater, and how do we portray violence as a positive outlook to change their mindset? If that makes sense.
Can you rephrase that?
Like basically, okay, how do you bring the youth into the theater, and how do we influence them, our youth, to believe that violence is wrong and that we can change that and that we have the power to change that?
Okay, good question. I grew up in a very different, in some ways, different world. Many of the people here grew up at a time when we had an existential fear of the world coming to an end. When I was in school, we had an atomic bomb. Remember that? You put your head in the tree, kiss your ass goodbye. You know, when there's a bright light, the world comes to an end. We grew up living, thinking the world was going to come to an end. So that's a kind of gun to your head in a very real way. The debates in those days were if your parents have a shelter and the neighbors don't, what's the moral issue of letting the neighbors in, or do you keep them out? That's what we used to sit around and debate. But I remember the movies I saw at the time. I mean, I remember a movie by a director named Phil Carlson. It was a B movie director then. It took the French to come along and tell us what a great director Phil Carlson was, making low-budget movies. And as a kid, I remember seeing the Phoenix City Story. These were movies where people were driven to the point of despair. And then, at the end, when they got a hold of the person who had caused all this problem, they stood over them, and then they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. That's not the way it's done anymore. Now you're manipulated to the point where you can't wait to see that person blow people away. This is one of the paradoxes. We live in a country that's so intensely, suddenly Christian. They quote Jesus at the drop of a hat. But by God, those same people can't wait to see movies like Quentin Tarantino's movies. To me, the most disturbing scene I have ever seen was in that movie he did about World War II. When that Jewish man came out of that tunnel and took a baseball bat to the head of a German Nazi soldier who was on his knees and beat him to a pulp, and the audience cheered. Yeah. They cheered. I couldn't believe it. That, to me, is the worst kind of obscenity, to manipulate an audience so that when somebody, I don't care who it is, yes, it's a Jew, and yes, he's something at the heads of the Nazis, and yes, this is a Nazi, who, by the way, refused to name and give information about his friends, which we would call heroic in a sense, who's handcuffed. And then this Jewish athlete, baseball, whatever, with a bat, beats him to death, and the audience, including Jews, cheers. That would be unthinkable to my generation. So I don't know. I mean, something's changed, and I'm not sure what, but we're being manipulated by violence in a totally different way.
And yet Shakespeare wrote Merchant of Venice, okay, 400 years ago. And that was, well, maybe he had to. And we try and find compassion in his play for Shylock, but ultimately it was the expulsion of the Jews in London that fueled the play. And, whichever way you look at it, it's still a very difficult play to produce today. That's all about hatred, the stuff that's going on in Syria right now, that's going on in Egypt.
Michael? She's been waiting, right? Been so patient.
All right. Please then.
Okay, thank you. Joe, let me just ask you this because you know my connection with ruin. My concern when I knew you were going to do the play was the fact that you could find the backstory everywhere. Videos, CNN, and you could see the violence. So I was wondering, what thought process, knowing that, and you're looking at this body of work, how do you decide to stage it and give us the masterpiece that we have without, all the violence and with people still wanting to come, even though they can find the backstory and they know what it is. So they're obviously making a difference between what they're seeing here and what the backstory is, which is too unbearable. And also the fact that in this audience, every night, you're going to find a woman who was raped. How did you manage it? And what was the thought process?
Well, Lynn Nottage managed that. And the fact is that the reason I think the play works so well is because it's all about style. And she found the perfect style. And it's always about style because that's what makes some violence work for us and some violence, abhorrent. It's about the way it's presented, not what's presented. It isn't the what, it's the how that always matters in the arts. Lynn Nottage presented this in a whorehouse with all of these horrors going on, but in such a way that it is truly a great piece of theater, which means it has so much more than just those horror stories, so much more than just it has music, it has passion, it has comedy, it has humanity. It's overflowing with humanity. So it's all about the style and the language and the fact that she was able to incorporate so many of these things into a play that at the same time brings people to a moment where they have some kind of theatrical experience. It's basically uplifting. I mean, that's the playwright. I mean, when you have that, when you've got that to work with, you're so far ahead of the game. That's why I wanted to do the play, even though I knew it was not going to be an easy sell. And because plays that hit people and that deal with things like war and atrocity. Well, look, let's be honest. You're going to the Congo to hell. This lovely lady is started an organization called the Footprints Foundation. We did a preview for her organization where all the proceeds went to them, and they're raising $75,000 to send 4 people. All 4 of them, by the way, are going to the Congo at their own expense. Nobody's paying for it. They're volunteering. They have to have the money to do the things they're doing, but no one's paying them or even paying their way. And they're going there for, what, a month?
Yeah, about 3 weeks.
3 weeks to teach 25 women how to help the women in these villages. And then they'll come back and report on how they did and hopefully raise a couple of 100,000 more. Well, but the point is, everybody in this country pays lip service to what's going on there. Everybody says something about it, but nobody really seems to care that much. It doesn't really, it's a shame, it's terrible, whatever, but what can we do? We feel helpless. You're doing something about it. I keep telling the audience all the time, I know how helpless you feel. And you even feel that if you send your money to Haiti or Africa, it's probably going to find its way into the wrong hands anyway. We have to find people like you at the Footprints Foundation that are accountable. And because it feels so much better to be able to do something. And in a way, that's what we hope this play accomplishes. And this has been a great opportunity to keep talking about Footprints Foundation. I mean, in a small way. I mean, some people would say, well, 75,000, 4 people, 25 being trained. But it's a start.
It's going to save lives.
And it's going to save lives, literally. People's lives, not just, So But why don't we care? I don't know. To me, the most horrible thing, I couldn't sleep well. Well, there's a lot of nights I can't sleep well. But anyway, last night, I said this to Donna when I was I'm reading the New York Times. I don't know how many of you saw that article about 4 young people in, I think, Afghanistan, some village in Afghanistan, that the religious fanatics grabbed, and because of Sharia law, they accused them of doing something. And it was graphically written about. They tied them to stones and then took them to the town square, where they tied them to stones, and then with shears that were made by a blacksmith, they cut off their right hand and their left leg in a public place. I couldn't sleep well after reading that. And what do you feel when you read that? You separate yourselves from those people and feel somewhat superior. Look at these people. What can we do about people who act that way? They're not like us. You know, I mean, it's so easy to dismiss that. You know, that woman who was there from when we did the Footprints Foundation, that wonderful woman who's a doctor from Cornell University, said, sad to say, but when I go to the Congo, you know what the women say to me? It's the men who are at fault. The men have destroyed our country. The men have destroyed our country. Well, I said to say, I think that's probably true in this country, too. What can I say? Why do you think we need women to get out and vote in November? But anyway, that's violence, by the way. But how do you deal with it?
I believe that our generation has become so visually enhanced that we need to see everything in our faces to really understand it. And I think that's where the true problem lies, especially with our generation, also with technology, where it's so much our head is down and we're not actually looking up and listening to what's going on. Like, how many people nowadays say that they actually call someone? No, I just sent a text. So that's also where it goes with imagery words, where this show, I saw it, and there was one line in particular that she smelled like raw meat or rotten meat. And I saw this show maybe 3 years ago, and that line will never leave my brain because I just like smelled it and I saw it. You don't actually see it. You don't see why she smells that way, but I can imagine everything. And due to us being so visual and us having to see, I'm not saying everyone, but a large majority, having to see that visual aspect in life, we lose our imagination to when we do hear things. And that's where the separation, I believe, from theater and film is really at the forefront for me. Like, having heard everything really made me realize this today. And also how, when we actually see something on stage, how someone can relate, or you might not relate to certain things, like a Scottish play. And that's where I think also film and theater do have some commonality still, but when it comes to the words and the visual, that's where I feel the separation has taken a big toll.
Well, I'm pretty sure everybody will agree that we're dissing the film industry, but there are so many influential films, fine films, that send you away from a cinema really provoked and thinking and ready to actually take action. I think the only way to address the issue of a new generation whose heads are down and not up communicating is to lead in our schools and in our trainings and in our homes, lead those students who want to make film, specifically, to look toward fine filmmaking that says something positive, activates, but doesn't destroy. And if we just go day by day initiating that, we can move the generation in to another culture, in a way. But we all have to do it. My question about doing plays like this is, are they actually not already preaching to the choir? Just by dint of attending theater, you think about things. You wouldn't be here if you didn't, not just tonight at the forum, but to theater in general. You feed off it. You probably would be starved if you didn't have theater in your lives. You are the choir. What we need to do somehow is get these plays that have these amazing messages to another audience, an audience who isn't in the theater. an audience who needs to see the plight of these women, what's going on in the Congo. And the same, for all sorts of, topographical areas, not just that kind of audience. But anyway, that question's up.
Right. Just a quick comment. This relates to a lot of what we've said. But and this is not my only concern with film censorship in Hollywood, but one of the points is that for a movie to be PG-13, it cannot have realistic blood. And to me, that's almost counterintuitive because it does not show the consequences of the violence. So that touches on a lot of it.
Interesting.
Yes.
I had a similar reaction to the play Ruined and to the films The Killing Fields and Sophie's Choice. I felt that I lost a piece of my heart. And when it was over, it was almost physically hard to get up. But I think in general, the difference between film violence and theatrical violence is theatrical violence has to do with the dramatic arc. It belongs there. In film violence, it's almost stopwatch. Okay, 6 minutes, time to kill off somebody. 6 minutes, time to kill off 3 people. And I think that's the big difference, that it's gratuitous in many films, but it has integrity in the theater usually.
Yes.
I wanted to bring up the two things. Going back to the film, I find that sometimes the anticipation of violence tends to be more effective in film than violence itself. And I'm going to use Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life as an example. It's an experimental film, and it explores Angle, a little boy, in a very peculiar way. And the most, I would say, the most intense scene for me was one of the most was he was with his little brother, and then you already have been realizing he's feeling a certain amount of there's some animosity between them, and they're playing with a socket of a light of a lamp, and you're just waiting for him to electrocute his little brother. It's a really odd scene. Nothing happens, but it affects you. Like, think about like these different things, all these different things come towards you. And I also wanted to say, if the anticipation is there, and that the effectiveness of anticipation is there, but then also what happens when you remove violence completely, as if we were to take something like Julia Taymor's depiction and put it in the film, that will completely, to me, that might completely remove a person from a film.
Her Titus Andronicus on film is a particularly spectacular work. It's very interesting taking theatre, as she did, and moving it into film. Yeah, interesting comment.
I'm just curious to ask the audience, the younger people who are here, because I assume many of you go to the theater, care about theater. Why do you think the rest of the people you know of your age group don't seem to want to go to the theater? What keeps them from making that leap of faith and showing up? Because, I've always believed if they come to the right play, we can hook them and they'll come back. But it is so hard to lure them in. Why is that? I'm assuming you guys are theater goers, regular theater. Yeah, why don't you just...
My friends, I'm a major at FIU Theater, and they recently saw me in a show, and they just said that it's uncomfortable.
They're what?
They're uncomfortable.
What do you mean? The seats are uncomfortable?
To be so close to a person performing something such as like a rape scene in particular, they get too uncomfortable. Yet they'll see it in a film and they're so separated from it, it's not really happening right in front of
Well,
them. per
that
se.
explains why they don't want to see violence, which is kind of hard for me to believe. But then what about all the other plays they don't go to see? I mean, I find it hard to believe the reason we can't draw more young people is because our plays are too violent. I mean, I'd like to believe that, but I can't. Yeah.
I think it has to do with what you were saying earlier about bringing the young actors. They come in, and it's hard for them to. They want it to be more close to their own lives, like less levels to relate to the character. I can read a play, and I'll read Othello, and I'll understand the heartbreak
Like, it's easy for me to relate to the characters, but I think that a lot of people that are younger, my age, they don't like having to make the connections. They like it to be somebody just like them. So the metaphors and the symbols, that's more work.
But we've done so.
Our generation, we love the instant gratification. Like, if the internet is slow, I mean, a web page takes more than 5 seconds. Like, I think I'm 26, and I think a lot of like 20 and 19-year-olds never even have dial-up.
Yeah.
You know, I can wait a little bit, but like having to do more work and taking time to generate the metaphors and the connections and feel what the character feels, like it's, you know, maybe as a person that likes to skateboard wants to go watch a play about a skateboarder. Like that's how many levels they want to go through just one.
Mark, don't kill me, but I'm going to put you on the spot here. Yeah. This is Mark Delaventura. He's a fabulous actor and playwright, just an incredibly talented young artist in South Florida. Mark, I know you and your friend David Sroyce are very concerned about getting younger audiences into the theater, and the work that you're doing at Alliance Theater Lab is starting that process. But what thoughts do you have on getting your peer group to come and see the work?
I mean, when I was a student, it enticed me when it was free. No, it's true. Like Joe and Ricky Martinez at New Theater, when they came to talk to us at New World, they were like, any show this season, email me, I will get a seat for you. And then, then some theaters like Slow Burn charge $20 for a student ticket, which for me, sorry, I'm not going to pay $20 to see a show.
You gotta eat.
That's right. But I think it's about making it more relatable. Like, I mean, me in my life, I can't write something like the Scottish play. I can write Judd Apatow kind of humor because that's where I'm at in my life. And I know people of my generation can kind of connect to that. And then, I don't know, you just hope, because how Joe was saying about humanity, you just hope that it's universal. Anyone can connect to humanity, you know? I did a show, my one-person show, about having a small penis, and I had women come up to me saying, thank you for doing this. Like, I understand. It's nice to hear a man be insecure about their bodies, you know? And I didn't think people in their 50s, 60s, 70s were going to... Yeah, people were just like, I remember it.
Didn't you ever hear what Woody Allen said? It's men who suffer from penis envy, not women. Didn't know that, Mark?
But no, David and I, and at the Alliance, we're trying our hardest to connect. But again, we had a meeting with Michael Payton, and it's marketing. Nobody knows. People who don't go see theater don't know it exists. How do you get the word out without money?
Yeah, but dare I throw this out? Real devil's advocate here. Elitism. Theater as elitist. No, I'm sorry. I know, because there's a lot of folks. You're all not that. We're not that. We don't do it for that reason. But if you fast forward to the generation that's coming through with all the commonality of the technology that's allowing them to Facebook and be this thing called theater, this ritual that only happens once a night, not 6 times from 12 o'clock midday all the way through to the last show at 11 o'clock in the evening. There is an elitism about it in, I think, a lot of young people's minds, and it's alienating. When you finally get them here, they could have an incredible experience. The question is, what motivates, what draws, and how do they get here? And I think that question way back in the evening there, how are you going to how can we bring young people into theater? It's a huge question. It was a huge question 10 years ago. It's a huge question today. Interestingly enough, in Stratford, we saw this past summer, amongst the shows that we studied and then watched, Royal Shakespeare, a play called I, Cinna. Simple play about the character Cinna, who appears in Julius Caesar. And Cinna, the poet, has one scene, and he's virtually lynched by the mob. And that's when they're basically the revolution's happening, and they out, no art, we don't want art anymore, and poor sinner. So this character got developed by a director and one actor, and they set it in a contemporary time. And I went to see a performance of it, and it was so interesting because the show was interactive. The audience actually interacted, not speaking with, but writing. And I went, oh gosh, this is so amazing. Not just children. This wasn't just an educational thing. The audience was filled with adults. And they were all interacting by, of course, writing bits of poems and bits of thoughts and bits of this, that, and the other. So I've come back and I'm working with writers in a writers' circle in Homestead right now on history of Homestead, but as a theatrical presentation. And one of the things we're going to do is develop this interactivity with the audience. Not to say every play's got to be interactive, but with all the interactivity of the technology that kids use today, that might be something that begins to draw them into the experience of theater. But obviously every play can't be interactive that way. But it is a huge question. We haven't solved it.
I wanted to put on top of what you said because I went on the program and I saw that was actually made for children. It was unusual. The questions towards the end are really uncomfortable because one of the questions were what would you kill for? You're asking this to an audience maybe of 10-year-olds and you wonder what could touch it. And then they're also showing video footage of like the London riots that happened previously and Diana's funeral. And so the whole show was about the effect of violence and extremes to the children's audience. And I don't think in another country it could have been received as well. I don't know. Do you think something like that would have been received as well in Florida?
Well, we have to try it. That's the thing. You see,
Where was this?
This was in Stratford, the RSC.
Yeah. Well,
Just going back to this point, I just think that younger people see theater like that outside of the arts scene. They see it as it's expensive. Like it's expensive. You have that perception. And right now, if you think about it, when you go to the movie theater to see a 3D, you're paying $17 an hour. $17 for a movie. When you could, there's a movie theater. There's a theater that's $20 for the play. If you advertise or you saw that it was something that you could do, instead of going to the movies, you have that other choice.
Did you know there's a program through the Miami-Dade Department of Cultural Affairs called Culture Shock, where you can see almost any theater event. Now, I'm not talking about touring Broadway and stuff. I mean locally produced South Florida theater, which is great. $5.
and
All
they
you
don't,
have to
and
do
they
is
don't
go on
come.
that website.
And they don't. We took Terrell McCraney's production of Brothers Size, which was done here in the theater for our people. We took it to the Lou Rawls Theater at Florida Memorial University. And we couldn't, and it was $5 tickets, and we couldn't get it was the most pitiful audience, and that's on a campus, and that's Terrell McCraney. So when you talk about the cost, it really isn't the cost. What?
The perception people have.
Yeah.
Right.
Some people
theaters
are not
expensive.
involved.
What?
They have that perception. They don't even. It stops them from actually going online and looking for people.
Why does that stop them from going to concerts that cost a fortune?
I don't.
I mean, that's my
Yeah,
point.
yeah.
I don't get it. That perception never keeps them from standing online and going on literally online or going online to buy tickets. How much does it cost to go see a concert? How much does it
About
take?
$80.
$80. All right. How many plays they can see for $80?
I know that there are a great many questions still to be answered, but we've kept the panelists for almost 90 minutes. Can we take one more question and then show them our gratitude? Yes.
Well, let me preface it by saying we all know, everybody on the panel, and those of you who are young need to know that there's nothing new. So Aristotle thought that great theater purged the emotions. I'm simplifying. Purged the emotions and turned you into a greater person. But his best student, Plato, felt that tragedy actually made people kill people. And he didn't think you should go to see tragedy because he felt that it actually might create violence. And he was a great student, and he was profound. We still have the argument. Remember that the theaters were closed when Shakespeare and the Jacobeans were doing it because the Puritans fell. There was just too much violence, okay, and bad language. And we watched censorship in the United States come in, and after the fact we look back and think, okay, you're supposed to make love on a bed with 2 feet on the floor. Isn't that silly? So I would like to caution everybody to not, as every older generation does, including mine, assume that the young generation is going to hell in a handbag. Because every older generation has always assumed that the younger generation was doing that. The quick answer, I think, to getting young people in the theater is you get young people into baseball because you have Little League. So I think if you start kids going to the theater, I think there's hope. And Stratford works because they fill that immense theater with kids at every age, every summer, throughout their life. So by the time they become our age, they've seen all of Shakespeare's plays done 3 times, every Jacobean play done, every Restoration play done. You with me? I'm being
Yeah.
So I want to get back and ask the final question. So, do you recommend censorship?
Of course not.
No.
Of course not.
So we're talking about film versus theater. So I don't know. I just wanted to get back to the violence. So
I'm abstaining on that question.
No, really?
Yeah, really, Joe, really. No, I'm abstaining because I think selectivity is essential, and I'm now talking as a parent. And I'm sorry, when I teach my kids at school, yeah, I'm expecting them to take risks, but I'm also seeing them as a parent. They are developing, they're at a certain period of their lives, they're confused, they don't know where they're going half the time, and where we allow them to go, or how we guide them or not guide them is super, super important. And I think the same thing, quite honestly, is true of what we allow or permit young people to be seeing at different stages of their lives. It's a huge subject, and that's the thing that keeps me up at night. No, it really does. It really does.
Yeah.
Did your parents?
No, you see, my parents took me to the theater. Now parents are taking kids to the cinema as their first experience of culture, and that's where it starts. If parents started taking, or the school started busing, of course we know the problems, then that, we may end that problem.
Quick anecdote. Recently, and it sounds like a shameless plug, but I had a play called The Virgin of Little Havana. In other words, it's a play having to do with the immigrant situation here in Miami, done at Miami-Dade College 3 years ago. The person who directed the play, a professor at the college, teaches theater appreciation. As a humanities requirement, you're supposed to go see some sort of work of art. So kids will go, okay, we'll go to this play, it's here, it's free, let's get it over with. It played for 2 weeks like it always does. It plays 2 weekends. The first weekend was Columbus Day weekend. It was empty. Work got around. The next weekend it was packed. For the next year and a half, he's had students joining theater appreciation who have told him in every class, there's like 2 or 3 students who tell him, well, the reason why I joined, and I'm sorry because it sounds like a shameless plug, it's not about my play, it was simply because my play reflected a little bit the Miami experience, and they all said, I took theater appreciation because I didn't know that theater could actually speak to me, and when I saw this, I saw myself on stage. I saw my parents, I saw my grandparents. It's a comedy. Sorry, I had no violence. Next time I'll add some. But it was a comedy, nothing profound. Simply, people were able to see the young generation. Again, I agree with him wholeheartedly about instant gratification. Though I love the layers, as a writer, I'm also not 20 anymore. I can see how people are looking for that. They don't want to wait the 5 seconds for the download. They don't want to really go through, do the extra homework. So they found themselves on stage, and then now they're taking theater appreciation. And other stories, one of those people eventually ended, now she's in New York studying theater. So, again, something else, I don't know, another point of view.
Thank you very much. We'll be able to continue the discussion informally in a few minutes, but now will you join me in thanking these wonderful panelists.